So now we're going to learn how to make our very own custom functions. These can be used on worksheets, cells, or they can be used inside of the Visual Basic Editor itself in your code. Now, I prefer to use them in the Visual Basic only because I really don't want all the cells to have to constantly recalculate, but we're going to discuss that in a bit. Now, let's head over to the sheet in this workbook that's called UDF. So UDF is actually a common abbreviation. You'll see it on forums. It means custom function, but it literally stands for as user-defined functions. So if you see something like custom function or just Excel VBA functions or UDFs, those are all the same exact thing. So as you can see, we're going to be creating a function together called kgrams. In fact, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Control scroll wheel, zoom in a little bit for you. We're going to create one called kgrams. It's going to convert pounds to kilograms. And there's an old poem my mother actually taught me. It's 2 1/4 pounds of jam weighs about a kilogram. But to make the math a lot more simple, I've actually written down that we need to actually multiply whatever the input is, whatever the number of pounds is, by 0.45359. So we're just going to multiply it by that. It'll be a one-liner of code. And so here's what a function is, okay? Using a function is barely different than using a sub that we've been doing this whole time, except that a function will actually send back or return an answer once it's done. And that's the main distinction. The main benefit is the returned value or calculation that you get from a function. So let's go ahead and hop over into the Visual Basic Editor, the VBE, so Alt F11. So we're going to start not with the word sub like normal, we're going to start with the word function. And in fact, basically anywhere in a normal macro where you would normally use the word sub, we're actually going to now use the word function. So for example, end function or exit function if we needed to exit prematurely instead of exit sub. So function, space, and then you give it a name. In this case, we're going to give it the name kgrams. And when you open your parentheses, this is where you can put your custom parameters. In this case, the only parameter I really need is to put a value of how many pounds I need to convert. So maybe I'll use something like LBS for my custom variable. Now you can leave it alone like this, which would make it a variant type, or you could, say as variant. Now, if you knew that you needed a double, you could just say, I'm requiring it to be a number that is a double, and that would be fine too. So we'll just go ahead and tell it specifically, we know this is going to be a number that may or may not have decimals. So let's use a double. But again, you don't have to. All right, so what we're going to do now is we know the formula to get the kilograms is actually just take whatever their input number is and multiply it times that decimal, 0.45359. So all we would have to do is put the answer is this times that decimal. Now, anytime you're using a function, as you may recall, we're actually not just doing something and stopping. The whole point of this is to take an answer and return it to the user. So we're going to take whatever the title of your function is. In this case, it's kgrams. We're going to copy that and paste it, or you could retype it. We have to make sure that at the end of our function, we return something into a variable that is the title of the function itself. That's the key. So kgrams equals, if you had a function called hello, you'd need to make sure at the very end that hello equals whatever the value is. So in our case, kgrams, the answer to the function, equals LBS times 0.45359, and that is our entire function. So there's a couple ways you can call this forth. The first way we'll show you, as everybody wants to know, is how to use it on a worksheet. And just like that, you've actually created your own function. So if I do equals k, it even shows up on my functions list. So I'm going to hit the tab key, and the only input I have is a single value, and it can glean that from a range, taking the range.value by default. So if I hit my close parentheses and hit enter, it actually takes that number 1 and multiplied it times 0.45359. I could copy this down. Now you'll notice I only copied it down here because we're going to have an issue right there. It's taking everything and copying it just fine, but now we get a value error. It's taking cell A6, and whenever it calculates that, it's going to give a value error. That's because it's not accepting that the word TEN, the string of text, is not a double, so it's an invalid input. Just like any function, you need to put the correct parameters inside as the input. Now you can also use these functions that you're creating inside of VBA. In fact, that's what I prefer to do. So it's a very similar manner though. And it saves a lot of bulky code in using these, because you can use a custom function within one of your macros, and you can share that functionality with all your procedures. So rather than rewriting the same paragraph, you can just say, hey, what is the, if k grams of 12 equals something rather than whatever. So for example, I'm going to go to the immediate window. Rather than writing another macro, I'm going to say question mark k grams of 40. And then if I hit enter, it's going to go ahead and run that function for me and give me the answer. And as I said, some examples are using that in the immediate window, but another example is you could use that in your code. So you can say if k grams of 24 is greater than 60, then do something, or you do a message box k grams of whatever, or print that out with the debug.print. So that's a really beautiful thing. Let me show you another example. Now, rather than typing this one out, I actually snuck it into the very bottom of this module. So we're going to scroll there. This is a really unique example because rather than using another value, we're actually going to be using a range object. So instead of as a double or integer, we're going to be using a range object right here as the input. That means I have to select at least 3 cells if you're peeking ahead. What I'm doing is I'm converting inches to cubic feet. And to do that, you have to take one value times another value. So length times width times depth. And then take that and divide by 1744 to turn it into cubic feet. So what that means is whenever I select 3 cells or more, it's going to take the first cell of the range times the second cell that I have selected and times the third, and then divide that by 1744. So let's do an example of that. We can go to any sheet. We can actually keep it on the same sheet if we want. So 1, let's do 2, and maybe 5, for example. Now I'm going to do equals inches to cubic feet, so tab to autocomplete. Now I have to at least select 3 cells. And in fact, let me hit cancel. I forgot to put a breakpoint. So what I want to do is put a breakpoint right here. I want it to pause so we can see what's going on. So equals inches to cubic feet. I have to select a minimum of 3 cells because that's what the input needs, and hit enter. Now I put a breakpoint so we can see what's going on. We're returning whatever the answer is to the name of the macro. That's the key to functions. But I selected a range, and the first cell's value is 1, and then times 2 times 5, and they take that divided by 1744. So the answer is 5.3 whatever. Scientific notation. Let's just see what happens on the worksheet. There you go. So that seemed to work just fine. Another really common scenario that I use when I'm using custom functions is finding the last row of data for one of my many sheets that I'm organizing or maybe using. So something like this. Let me hit Alt F11. Let's create another one together. I'm going to scroll back up to kind of our main area. And for example, I'm going to call this one function get the employee sheet last row. Okay, this is a common thing we want to do, and I don't have any parameters because it's just flat out taking the employee sheet and getting the last row for me whenever I call it. Okay, so I'm going to say get employee. I'm going to hit Control Space to autocomplete. The name of this function is going to be this result. It's going to be the employee, let's see, code name is the code name of that. So that's the sheet code name, employee code name, dot cells, rows dot count, comma, we'll just use 1 dot end, Excel up dot row. That is how you get the row, the very last row on that sheet. And we can test that. Even though it's not a sub, we can still step through it. 11 is what it says. Sure enough, that is row 11, and so that's fine. But here's the beauty of it. Let's say I have another macro, a sub, and I'm going to call this test implr. So what I would do is, at the beginning of my code, I need to get the employee sheet's last row, and rather than remembering all this code every time and repeating that, I would just call that function, get employee LR. So that was Control Spacebar. So I want to call that function get employee LR, and I don't want to have to write down all that code again. So if I hit F8, now remember you can hit Shift F8 if you didn't want to actually go through all the steps of the other. So I'll show you that. Shift F8. It actually ran the other procedure, the other function, and returned the value of 11 to this variable. Now, if I had hit F8, it would have stepped through the other one, but Shift F8 will get you there faster, and that is the step over command. All right, we will see you in the next lecture where we learn about using optional parameters that are not required but could be used. We'll see you then.